Well, let's talk to the Shadow Environment Secretary, Luke Pollard, who joins us from Westminster. As was being pointed out there, the government has spent millions, hasn't it, on flood defences around the country. What more would you like it to do?
Well, they have spent millions, but they haven't spent enough. We know that with the climate crisis that we now have, we're going to have more extreme weather more frequently, and that's going to have more severe consequences, especially in those areas that are prone to flooding. Since 2010, we've seen 15% of the Environment Agency's budget taken away in cuts, and we've seen cuts to the fire and rescue service that were so pivotal in supporting many of the communities that were affected by flooding. So we need a different approach here, because simply more the same won't protect the communities that are at risk now, and that will be at risk in the future. And that's why only last year the Environment Agency, the government agency responsible for much of this flood prevention work, said they needed an extra £1 billion a year to get to the level of protection that many of our communities need. And I'm afraid we're nowhere near that level of funding from ministers at the moment.
So a Labour government would give the Environment Agency £1 billion, would it?
Well, I fear a Labour government is a few years off just at the moment. So my job is to put pressure on the ministers to make the right decision today, because promising...
Well, how much do you think the ministers should give?
Well, I think the ministers should listen to what the Environment Agency, their own officials, have said here. We know that we're going to need to take additional actions to protect some of our most vulnerable communities. Now, that means not only the flood defences that we've heard are so desperately needed, and make sure that work is completed before we get to really bad times of the year where we get bad weather like we've seen over the last few days, but we also need a different change of approach in terms of how we manage water in our entire economy. That means storing more water in upland areas, preventing the kind of surge of water that we've seen in many of our rivers, and that reduces the peak flow of the rivers, which makes it more manageable. Now, that means changing agricultural practices, planting more trees in certain areas, and it also means each and every one of us taking steps to reduce flood risk in our own areas. Think about how many gardens in your own area have been paved over to make additional parking in the past few years. There's things that we can all do to help floodwaters recede and also be managed, and that's why we need a new strategy from ministers, because what I'm hearing from colleagues like Holly Lynch, the MP for Halifax, who's been dealing with floodwaters in her own constituency, or the MPs in Leeds that have had a narrow escape of only being a few centimetres off the top of the flood defences, is that what we're seeing at the moment is only part of a bigger solution. We need a proper strategy to make sure that that we're getting the right money in the right locations at the right time. But ultimately, we need to recognise that the climate crisis will produce more extreme weather more often, and that's why we need a different approach to funding that flood prevention from ministers, and we need that very soon.
So you're not prepared to put a figure on how much they should spend. Where do you think the money could come from?
Oh, Labour was very supportive of additional flood prevention spending, and it was in our manifesto to support that work as part of a Green New Deal that looked at investing in greener jobs, and flood prevention work was a key part of that. But ministers have a choice today about where they spend the money that they've got, and the Environment Agency is at our front line, along with local authorities and water companies and fire and rescue services. Now, each and every one of those has been subject to massive cuts. Now, if austerity is over, as ministers have been telling us, although you and I both know that's not quite right, then let's see the money being put into those frontline services. Let's see those communities that have been flooded again, because many of the communities that have been flooded this time, that are still underwater or were nearly flooded, were promised that there would be action taken when they were flooded in the past. So let's see those promises delivered. Let's see proper funding. But let's remember that we're only going to see more of this in coming years because of the climate crisis, and that needs a different approach from ministers. There are communities that are uninsurable around our country that know they'll be flooded again in the future unless more assertive action is taken. And that's what I'll be calling for ministers to do in the next few days, to make sure that we learn the lessons, not only of this latest flooding, but the lessons that should have been learned from flooding that's taken place in the past as well.
OK. Luke Pollard, Shadow Environment Secretary, thank you.
Thank you.